Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Undeniable, where we discuss those amazing acts of God in our lives, those things where it's like, when we look at them, it's like, it's nothing but God, where y'all can debate all this other stuff, but you can't debate this experience. And so I'm joined today by Miss Vita Tucker, who has graced me to come on the channel to tell her story. And thank you, Vita. Welcome.
Very well.
So
my honor.
Thank you. It's definitely mine as well. So I wanted to get, because you got a story, and I wanted to hear about that story. Like we have many, but I know you have a specific one, because you're a mom.
Yeah.
And you have a story around being a mom. Your daughter, Chipo.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that.
It's kind of like it's a story and a journey.
Okay. Love those.
Together.
Yes, love the journeys.
So I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. Mm-hmm. My parents were uneducated. My mother had a 6th grade education. My father couldn't neither read nor write. But they were good, solid African-American citizens that went to work every day and made a living and took care of us. There were 6 of us, 3 of my sisters, and then 15 years later, there was 3 more of us, my brother, me, and my baby sister.
Okay.
And so I grew up in a Detroit, Michigan, black neighborhood. I'm a baby boomer. So, back then you played outside. You didn't have toys or things like that. You had to make up games and,
exactly.
It was really a wonderful experience the way I grew up. I mean, it was a neighborhood where everybody was in unity. It was real community. Not to say that we don't have community now, but it's a bit different, I grew up in a neighborhood where if you went to school down the street and your parents were already going off to work and Miss Jones was sitting on her porch and you had ashy legs, you had to come up on her porch and put some Vaseline on your legs to go to school. It was that kind of community. It was really a strong community.
You remind me of mine. Yeah, that's the same scenario, exactly. But in the Mississippi, Pascagoula.
Exactly.
And everybody knew each other.
Yes, and everybody took care of each other. Yeah. It was really a true neighborhood. Your neighbors' parents were your parents. If you did anything wrong, Miss Jones was going to tell your mama. And, your mama could look around corners. We say that the only person that can do that is Jesus, but I truly believe when I was a little girl that my mom could do it. But anyway, went to local schools. We weren't the kind of family where we were sending kids off to college or anything like that. I never did get an opportunity to go to college. In my family, when you reached 18, 19, and you graduated from school, you went to work so that you could contribute to the household. So I never got an opportunity to go to college, but I was a fast learner, and I knew that I was intelligent, and I knew that I was smart, and so I got very good jobs. I was one of the first African-American females to work at Ford Motor Company World Headquarters in Detroit.
Okay.
I worked on the public relations floor, and that was, I'm aging myself, but that was back when Henry Ford and Lee Iacocca were running the show.
Right.
So you got an education. I got an education that way. Mm-hmm. I got an education in the private industry world with big players, and, you had to be 3 times better than anybody else at your craft, and I was a secretary, and so that was really an important step, Anyway, as life goes on, I happened to meet a young man by the name of Neely Tucker. He worked at the Detroit Free Press. We became very good friends, and we married. And he became the foreign correspondent for the Detroit Free Press. And at the time that we married, he was taking a post in Warsaw, Poland, to cover the Sarajevo War.
Oh, wow.
So I was 10 years older than him, but we had a great friendship and a great relationship. Mm-hmm. And we went off to live in Warsaw, which was Poland.
Okay.
Yeah, which was in Poland. which was an experience all to itself because there were no Black people
Wow.
in Poland. So, you couldn't speak the language. He was there with me for 5 days, and then he went off to the war, and I was there to fend for myself, But I had chutzpah, and I learned how to speak and to do survival Polish and, traveled the countryside because there you could get on the train. You could be in Vienna one, weekend. You could be in Germany the next weekend. You could be in Russia the next weekend.
Yeah,
So I traveled a lot. So for me, coming from the roots that I came from and having these opportunities was wonderful, and I was, gung-ho, taking advantage of learning things and being in communities that challenged me, and these were communities that really challenged me. But it was just a wonderful experience. At the end of the Sarajevo War, we were there for about 4 years. He got reassigned to Africa, and that was during the pandemic, the HIV/AIDS pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And we were assigned to Africa. We lived in Zimbabwe.
Okay.
And he covered
the HIV.
Yeah, the HIV pandemic.
Okay.
He covered Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, some West African countries, but that was another opportunity for me. Although I couldn't work in Africa, I volunteered because HIV was such a prominent and devastating disease that people were, it was just incredibly horrific, to see families just decimated by this disease.
Yeah.
Because these were very marginalized communities, very, very poor people who had no means for, prevention methods and, were barely eating every day, let alone going to a doctor and, having medical diagnosis of their conditions and things like that. I mean, these people were living in huts and things like that. And so I volunteered at the local orphanage. I'm there, and at the HIV/AIDS orphanages, they were just full of children, just full of children that had been abandoned or their parents had died or, they were sick themselves. And I wrote a couple of grants to get money to subsidize some of these places where these children were.
Right.
Yeah, at the orphanage, children were just dying left and right, and it was a devastating thing to see. So whenever Neely would come back into town, we would go to the orphanage and we would take a couple of children home every weekend, take them to the hospital, make sure that they had some kind of care, had them diagnosed so the orphanage, directors and people that worked at the orphanage knew the conditions of some of the kids.
And the kids were dying of HIV?
Yeah, they were dying of malnutrition, they were dying of HIV, they were dying of, just circumstances that didn't lend itself for them to survive, And so we would take children home, every weekend, 2 or 3 kids, and we, nurse them, take them to the hospital to be diagnosed to see if there were anything that the doctors could do. We got volunteer nurses to come out to the orphanage to look at the children and do, some diagnostics on, the kids there. Got funding from the United States, from churches and things like that to help subsidize food and water, clothing, milk, things like that for the children. And that was a great experience, a great opportunity.
Was it a war-torn area as well?
It wasn't a war-torn area, but it was a very high-density area. And so it was, people that were uneducated, people that didn't have a means of income. It was great if you had a cow or a goat or some chickens or something that you could sell. It was great if you could be in a micro-enterprise project where women would, make straw hats or, jewelry or things like that, and you could sell that on the side of the road. But it was a very decimated community. Having been childless and not being able to have a child, this was a great opportunity for me to have a room full of babies all at one time that I could nurse. And so we would do that on the weekends. And one weekend, God showed up in a way that I never, ever, ever, ever expected him to do. We were in the orphanage, and we were deciding who to take home that weekend. And my husband, Neely, at the time, went by a crib, and he said, "Vita, come look at this baby." And I came, and I looked at the baby, and she was 3 months old, but you could put her in the palm of your hand.
Oh, wow.
She was
3 months old.
3 months old. You could put her in the palm of your hand. Her ribs were showing. She had a distended belly, and she could hardly breathe. You could see her struggling to breathe. So I asked the matron if I could take her home that weekend and try to get her to the doctor to see if we could get something to help her to sustain her breathing and to help her stabilize her in 2 or 3 days.
Yes.
So we took her home, took her to the doctor, but we had to take her back to the orphanage on that Monday.
Yeah. Now, were you a believer, a strong believer at that time?
I was a very strong believer at that time. I had been through some things where God had shown up before, but this is the most pivotal time that in my life that it made a drastic change, and it couldn't have been anybody but God.
Wow.
So we took her back to the orphanage that Monday. I dropped Neely off at the airport. He was off on another assignment. And something, somewhere, in my consciousness and in my heart said, go back to the orphanage. And I went back to the orphanage, and I went to the crib, and she was dying. I picked her up, hid her in a blanket, kidnapped her, put her in my car, and took her to the hospital.
Okay.
The doctor there, Dr. Paj, he looked at her, he said, she is not going to make it, Miss Tucker. He was saying to her, I went into another room, and I just got on my knees. I said, there is a reason why I went back to this orphanage and picked up this baby.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it's got something to do with you, God. I got on my knees and I said, if you give her to me, I'll never take her back.
Wow.
I was childless. I'd always wanted a kid of my own. I went back into the room, and in African hospitals, you had to supply all the medicine, all the food, all the care, everything you had to supply. The doctor put her in an oxygen tent, and he says, we're going to try to see if we can sustain her through the night. So one night she made it. Next night she made it. And he said if she makes it for a week, we got a good chance of, her survival.
Yeah.
She made it a week, 7 days. And then he said, it looks like she's going to make it. So I was up against all these odds because I was an American in a foreign country, in a country that in a culture that did not believe so much in adoption unless you were a part of that for your core family. And so the matron of the orphanage was nervous, and she was saying, Vita, you got to bring the baby back. And I said, I promise God I'm not taking this baby back. And she said, Vita, you got to bring the baby back. I said, I'm not bringing the baby back. God told me this is my baby.
Wow.
So I fought them.
Yeah.
The matron was basically on my side. She wanted to see children survive.
Yes.
And she knew we were doing good things at the orphanage to subsidize things that she just didn't have the power to, to bring into play. And so
that was the system.
Yeah, the system.
Yeah.
And so she helped me to talk to the authorities.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Paj helped me. He says, he told the authorities, said, if she takes her back, she's just going to deteriorate and die. Is that what you want to happen? And the authorities said, no, we don't want that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so I took her home, and started a regimen of care, and about 2 months, she stayed with me for about 2 months. And the authority says, okay, now you got to bring her back. I got on my knees. I said, I know this is my baby. I need you to help me. I know I come 10,000 miles to be a mama. I'm not letting this go easy.
Yeah.
And we dealt with the authorities. It took us about 6-7 months. And finally, the authorities allowed us to start the adoption process. And it took about another year after that before it was finalized.
Yeah.
And
so was that a battle, or even with?
It was a big battle. It was a battle. My husband was white. Okay, so he was not favored, and he was writing stories about Mugabe and the political situation in Zimbabwe and in other countries, the pandemic and the devastation there. And, he was not politically correct as far as they were concerned. So there was a battle there to put us out of the country. It was strange because, we'd be sitting up in the middle of the night and the lights would go off, or they'd shut the water off.
On purpose?
Yeah. Yeah, it was targeted. Yes, we were targeted. It was a sign for us to leave the country without that child, but God was on our side. He was on our side. It was so evident to me. I mean, it was just, and maybe people won't get it from my telling the story, but people know with their own experiences with God, that is God. For one thing, I grew up in a community, like I said, of African-American community. I didn't have a real education other than a high school education. I never went to college. And here I was on the other side of the world. I've gone to Poland, I've lived in other countries, and a little skinny black girl, skinny-legged black girl from Detroit on the other side of the continent living in Africa, doing the things that I was doing. I just never, in my wildest imagination, could ever thought that this was going to be my destiny, that this was going to be my journey in life, and that a part of that would be this story about, creating a relationship with Chipo and then adopting her and bringing her back into the United States. She was 3 months old. She's 25 years old now. She's doing a master's program at Johns Hopkins University. Wow. Very, very proud of her. It was a struggle, but it was a struggle that at one point I just didn't worry about because I knew that it had already been decided.
Yeah.
How just some things have already come to fruition in your life.
So even when you were going through
I knew it.
Yeah.
I mean, every struggle. My husband wasn't a big believer, but I was. And he would say, how can you be so calm about it? He loved this little girl. And he was like, we're just going to have to, we're going to have to cross the border at night and, get out of Dodge. I'm going to lose my job, all kinds of things. He was worried about those kinds of things. And those were legitimate fears to have. But I just didn't have those fears. We are peculiar people that are in the world, but not of the world.
Yes.
And I took it to heart, I took it to heart, his messages of, no weapon formed against you shall prosper. All things will work out. We push for the prize that is in Christ Jesus. She's 25 years old doing.
So were there any, during that journey, she's with you, were those little bitty things, little signs of favor or little things that's like, almost this, almost that, and okay, God spared you. And
there's, Zimbabweans, they have a totem culture, spirit and totem, the animal totem or something of that nature mixed with a spiritual belief. So one day the authorities came to talk to us about keeping Chipo, and there were 2 or 3 people that came from the social service network. And there was this one woman who sat next to me, and I had Chipo on my lap. And she was just happy-go-lucky, fat and happy. And this lady said, give me the child. I need to hold the child. And Chipo just would not go. She screamed. She jumped out of my arms. I mean, she just... And the woman got really frightened. It was very superstitious. She's very superstitious. She got really frightened. She stood up in the middle of the room and she says, yes, you must take this child. And she left the house.
Really?
And we never heard from the authorities until they asked us to come into the court and sign the adoption paper.
Oh, wow. So who was this woman?
She was a part of the social services network. She was supposed to come in and interview us and look at the house and make sure he was doing an inspection to make sure the child was being cared for, that there wasn't any money passing hands or any illegal activity going on. And so she came to check that out. But she really wanted to take the child. She really wanted to take Chipo. She wanted to say that, because they have a staunch belief in not, adoption is not, especially from foreigners, is just not something that is a common process.
So that wasn't her attempt to hold Chipo.
It was really her attempt to take Chipo. Oh. But Chipo wasn't having it, and neither was Jesus. So it didn't happen that day. Just little things like that. The paperwork went smoothly after they surrendered themselves to the possibility of us adopting. The paperwork. They lost the paperwork. Every time you go to the court, they couldn't find the paperwork. You'd have to go back in the file room, and it would be buried under mounds of papers. It would take them 2 weeks, 3 weeks to find things like that. And then one day you go, and the paperwork was right there.
Everything is in place.
Everything was in place.
Wow.
Everything to help convict me
Yeah.
that this process was supposed to be what it was. Yeah.
Now, now you get out of, and you can come back home to America.
Yeah.
Any other things going on just in that transition?
Yeah, her adoption process when we got back to here, Neely started working for the Washington Post as a correspondent, and there were things in her adoption process that did not go well on this side, stateside.
Mm-hmm.
Paperwork that wasn't fully completed, just odds and ends of things that, they could have been disastrous, but we just go to sleep at night and then the next morning it would be okay.
Where?
So
more opportunities that took you to your knees.
Yes, I could go on and on about little quirky stuff that happened that we thought would be disastrous, but never came to fruition.
Wow.
It was a horrible experience, but at the same time, it was a wonderful experience.
Yeah.
Because at every roadblock that we faced, every stronghold that we thought was going to take over the situation, there was a light at the end of the tunnel, a light unto our path, a lamp unto our footstep.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what would you say to people who, even in a situation like that, or even similar,
God has a destiny for you. It's not always loud, it's not always pronounced, but if you believe, if you have a strong belief system, you don't have to prove it to anybody. You don't have to talk about it. You just need to believe it.
Right.
We are not perfect people,
Really?
And there are a lot of things in that process that I did wrong, a lot of things that I said wrong, but I had a deep belief that this was going to bring joy into my life and change my life forever. Yeah. And I sat quiet with that. It was quiet in my soul. There was a lot going on outside, but I sat quiet with it, and I hear people always talk about, well, you have to be on your knees and pray. You have to do it. I didn't do any of those things. I just believed.
Yeah.
And I walked in my belief.
Yeah.
I talked silently. And I carried things silently.
Right.
And he spoke to me in that silence. And it wasn't an audible voice. It was just the words of the Bible that says, I have plans for your life. Look at what's happening in your life. Did you ever think that you would come from 25th Street in Detroit, Michigan to Zimbabwe, living in 1.5 acres of land in a wonderful hacienda house? Did you think that was going to happen? And I would always look back to where I came from, to where I was, and it would open up the doors to opportunities that I could look at in the future. It doesn't have to be loud. It does. It's just, for me, it was very personal.
Yeah.
And I took it as a personal message that pass this forward. This is a testimony that I'm giving you where you can say that you live this existence, that you came from this place on your journey and your destiny is here. And then there's other things that are out there for you, and I learned to live quietly with that. It doesn't have to be loud. It is solid.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah.
Which you made me think about. Got another video with someone coming up, and we want to talk about the differences in God hoping and being in the midst of your of issues and things that you're dealing with when you're taking it head on and when you're not have your head in the sand. But if you have your head in the sand, it's like, okay, are you giving God something to work with?
Yeah.
You might be praying about it, but are you avoiding it? But it sounds like in every step, your head's up and dealing with it face on.
It was rough, but I learned that, I didn't have an infrastructure there, family and things like that I could, talk to. My church was not there, and so I had to learn how to deal with things internally. I prayed and I talked to God, but my relationship was more than prayer. It was gut level. It was like, okay, Jesus, come on now.
Yeah. I love that.
Come on, this is overwhelming.
Yeah.
I ain't got nobody to talk to, but I know you're there because I know this thing that's happening in my life. I would have never picked this for me.
Yeah.
So there's something there, but it was guttural. It was just like, okay, come on now.
Wow.
I don't know how this is supposed to work. I don't know what I'm supposed to do tomorrow. How I'm going to face this trial today. It was internalized, and it strengthened me, and it gave me a confidence because it was a testimony that was being produced.
Yeah.
That somebody was going to ask about this story. Chipo gave that story. When she graduated from high school, she was one of the seniors that gave her testimony in the church, and it impacted so many people. After she gave that testimony, there was a long line of people that were just wanted to talk to her. I was so proud of her, for understanding that what had happened in her life could possibly help somebody else and to pass it on, So I would say destiny and journey is not always loud. It's not always clear, but it's there. These promises that's that. Abundance is not always money or things. It can be just a spiritual relationship with God. It could be a silent feeling of confidence and security, always love. It's just not all the things that maybe we expect, when we read the Bible and you want things to jump off the page. Sometimes it comes in the middle of the night. I've gotten up in the middle of the night and said, thank you. This just, this life that you've given me, these experiences that you've given me are much more than money or gold. These are things, these are experiences with you.
Wow.
That's important.
Well, I think that's another amen moment.
Oh.
That's how I like to close out now, because that's a powerful story.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for joining us again, and for another episode of Undeniable. And please like and subscribe, and we have more powerful stories coming to you. Take care. God bless.
Bye, everybody.